In 2019, 8-year-old Emma Martinez stopped eating at her grandmother's house in San Antonio, Texas, displaying behavior that baffled her loving family. What began as simple meal refusal during their weekly Sunday visits would escalate into a medical mystery that threatened Emma's health and exposed a dangerous secret hidden within the walls of the home where her father had grown up. But it would take one doctor's crucial question to uncover the shocking truth that had been slowly poisoning an entire family. Maria Martinez first noticed something was wrong on a humid Sunday afternoon in late September. She watched her usually cheerful 8-year-old daughter push away a plate of her grandmother's famous tamales, the same ones Emma had devoured just months before. "Mija, you haven't touched your food," Maria said gently, reaching across the dining table to feel Emma's forehead. "Are you feeling sick?" Emma shook her head, her dark eyes darting nervously around the familiar dining room of Grandma Rosa's house. The room was exactly as it had been for decades, worn wooden furniture, family photos covering every surface, and the persistent smell of old cooking oil that seemed to cling to everything. "I'm just not hungry, Mama," Emma whispered, scooting her chair back from the table. Carlos Martinez, Emma's father, looked up from his own plate with concern. "Emma, Abuela spent all morning making these just for you. You love her tamales." "I know, Papa, but my tummy feels funny," Emma said, wrapping her arms around her small frame. Grandma Rosa, a sturdy woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, waved her hand dismissively. "She's just being picky. Kids these days, they don't appreciate good food." She spoke with the slight accent that had never left her voice, despite 50 years in Texas. Maria exchanged a worried glance with her husband. Emma had always been an enthusiastic eater, especially when it came to her grandmother's cooking. The little girl had been coming to this house every Sunday since she was born, running through the same hallways where her father had played as a child, sitting in the same chair she occupied now. "Maybe she's coming down with something," Maria suggested, standing to clear Emma's untouched plate. No, leave it," Rosa insisted. "She'll eat when she gets hungry enough." But Emma didn't eat. She sat quietly while the adults finished their meal, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen with an expression Maria couldn't quite identify. It wasn't defiance. Emma was generally an obedient child. It was something else, something that made Maria's maternal instincts prickle with unease. After lunch, while Carlos helped his mother with dishes, Maria found Emma sitting alone on the front porch, staring out at the quiet neighborhood street. "Emma, baby, what's wrong?" Maria sat down beside her daughter on the old wooden steps. "Nothing, Mama. I just don't like eating here anymore." "But why? You've always loved coming to Grandma's house." Emma was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on her dress. "The food tastes funny now." Maria frowned. "Funny how?" "I don't know, just different. It makes my mouth feel weird." Before Maria could ask more questions, Carlos emerged from the house with 4-year-old Diego, Emma's younger brother, who had been napping on Rosa's couch. "Ready to go?" Carlos asked, jangling his car keys. Emma jumped up immediately, more eager to leave than Maria had ever seen her. Usually they had to coax both children away from their grandmother's house, where they loved exploring the backyard and playing with Rosa's collection of old toys. The drive home was unusually quiet. Diego chatted about a cartoon he'd watched, but Emma stared out the window, lost in thought. That night, as Maria tucked Emma into bed, she tried once more to understand what had happened. "Emma, you know you can tell Mama anything, right?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Is there something about Grandma's house that's bothering you?" "The food just tastes bad now, Mama. I don't want to eat it anymore." Maria kissed her daughter's forehead, noting that Emma felt slightly warm. "Okay, baby, we'll figure it out." Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Every Sunday, the Martinez family would drive to Rosa's house for their traditional family dinner. Emma would sit politely at the table, but she wouldn't take a single bite of food. She'd drink water or juice if offered, but anything solid remained untouched. Rosa grew increasingly frustrated. "There's nothing wrong with my food," she declared after the 3rd week. "I've been cooking the same recipes for 40 years. Carlos grew up eating this food. And look how strong and healthy he is." Carlos found himself caught between his wife's growing concern and his mother's wounded pride. "Maybe we should take her to see Dr. Peterson," he suggested quietly to Maria one evening. "I think you're right," Maria agreed. "This isn't normal. She's lost 4 pounds in 3 weeks." The weight loss was what finally convinced Carlos they needed professional help. Emma had always been petite, but now her clothes hung loose on her small frame. Her energy levels had dropped, and she seemed anxious every Sunday morning when she knew they were going to visit Grandma Rosa. Dr. James Peterson had been Emma's pediatrician since birth. A kind man in his 60s with graying hair and gentle hands, he listened carefully as Maria described Emma's behavior. "She only refuses to eat at your mother-in-law's house," he asked Carlos. "That's right. At home, at school, at restaurants, she eats normally everywhere else. But the moment we sit down at my mother's table, she won't touch anything." Dr. Peterson examined Emma thoroughly, checking her throat, listening to her lungs and palpating her abdomen. "Any nausea, Emma?" "Sometimes," Emma admitted quietly, "but only when I smell the food at Grandma's house." "What does it smell like?" Emma scrunched up her nose. "Like metal. And something else, something yucky." Dr. Peterson made notes in Emma's chart, his expression thoughtful. "Has anyone else in the family experienced any symptoms? Headaches, stomach upset, fatigue?" Maria and Carlos looked at each other. "Now that you mention it," Carlos said slowly, "I have been getting headaches after our Sunday visits, but I thought it was just stress from work. And Diego has been more tired than usual on Sunday evenings," Maria added. "But he's only 4. We figured he was just worn out from playing." Dr. Peterson nodded. "I'd like to run some blood tests on Emma, just to rule out any underlying conditions. In the meantime, I want you to pay close attention to her symptoms and when they occur." As they scheduled the blood work appointment, Dr. Peterson pulled Maria aside. "Children are often more sensitive to environmental factors than adults. Emma's body might be reacting to something in the house that the rest of you haven't noticed yet." "What kind of environmental factors?" Maria asked. "Could be anything. Cleaning products, air fresheners, mold, pest control chemicals. Old houses can harbor all sorts of things that affect people differently." The blood tests came back normal, which was both reassuring and frustrating. Emma was healthy by all medical standards, yet she continued to refuse food at Rosa's house and was steadily losing weight. By November, Emma's refusal to eat had evolved into something more concerning. She began experiencing what appeared to be anxiety attacks every Sunday morning. "I don't want to go to Grandma's house," she would cry, clinging to Maria's legs. "Please don't make me go." "But sweetheart, we're not asking you to eat anything. You can just visit with Grandma," Maria would soothe. "No, Mama, please. Something's wrong there. Something's making me sick." The panic in Emma's voice was real and heartbreaking. Carlos found himself torn between honoring his family's Sunday tradition and protecting his daughter's well-being. Rosa, meanwhile, had become defensive and hurt. "That child is being manipulative," she told Carlos during one of their phone conversations. "She's learned that if she acts sick, she gets attention. You're spoiling her." "Mom, she's lost 7 pounds. This isn't about attention." "Children go through phases, Carlos. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." But when Emma began having nightmares about being forced to eat at Grandma's house, Maria knew they needed to seek help beyond their family pediatrician. "I think we need to see a specialist," she told Carlos one evening after Emma had woken up crying for the 3rd time that week. "What kind of specialist?" "I don't know. Someone who understands children's behavior, maybe? Or someone who deals with eating disorders?" Carlos ran his hands through his hair, exhausted. "She's 8 years old, Maria. 8-year-olds don't have eating disorders." "Then what's happening to our daughter?" It was a question that would haunt both parents in the weeks to come. Emma's symptoms were becoming more severe, and yet every medical test came back normal. She was a healthy child who simply couldn't or wouldn't eat food in one specific location. The breaking point came in early December. Emma had been particularly anxious about their Sunday visit, begging her parents to let her stay home. When they insisted she come along, promising she wouldn't have to eat anything, Emma had what could only be described as a panic attack in Rosa's driveway. "I can't go in there, Mama," she sobbed, hyperventilating in the back seat of their car. "Something bad is in there. Something that makes me sick." Maria held her daughter, while Carlos sat in stunned silence, staring at his childhood home. The house looked the same as it always had, a modest single-story ranch with beige siding and a small front garden. Nothing appeared threatening or dangerous, but Emma's terror was undeniable. That night, after they'd returned home without going inside Rosa's house, Maria made a decision that would change everything. I'm calling Dr. Peterson first thing Monday morning, she told Carlos. We need a referral to someone who can help us figure this out. Emma's not making this up, and it's not just a phase. Something is genuinely wrong, and we're going to find out what it is. Carlos nodded, looking at his daughter's bedroom door, where Emma had finally fallen asleep after hours of tearful reassurance. You're right. We can't let this continue. Neither parent could have imagined that their search for answers would lead them to a pediatric specialist who would ask one simple question that would expose a decades-old secret hiding in plain sight, threatening not just Emma's health, but the well-being of their entire family. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen her share of unusual pediatric cases during her 15 years of practice, but Emma Martinez's situation immediately caught her attention. When Dr. Peterson's referral came through in mid-December, along with detailed notes about Emma's location-specific food aversion, Dr. Chen cleared her schedule for a comprehensive evaluation. Behavioral pediatrics can be complex, Dr. Chen explained to Maria and Carlos during their first appointment. Children often express emotional or physical distress in ways that seem puzzling to adults, but there's usually an underlying cause. Dr. Chen was in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanor that immediately put Emma at ease. Her office was designed to be child-friendly, with colorful artwork and toys, but it also contained sophisticated medical equipment that spoke to her expertise. Emma, can you tell me about the last time you tried to eat at your grandmother's house? Dr. Chen asked gently. Emma shifted in her chair, glancing at her parents before answering. It was a long time ago. Maybe when the leaves were still green. That would be early fall, Maria clarified. She hasn't eaten there since late September. What happens when you smell the food there? Dr. Chen continued. My mouth gets all tingly, and then my tummy starts to hurt, Emma explained. And sometimes I feel dizzy. Dr. Chen made careful notes. These are very specific physical symptoms. Emma, when you eat the same foods at home, like if your mum makes tamales, do you have any problems? Emma shook her head vigorously. No, I love Mama's tamales. They taste good and make me happy. But your grandmother's tamales make you feel sick. They smell wrong, Emma said quietly. Like when Papa works on the car and his hands smell like metal. Dr. Chen's pen paused over her notepad. Metallic smell. That's interesting. Carlos, has anyone else mentioned noticing unusual odors in your mother's house? Carlos shook his head. Not that I'm aware of, but honestly, I grew up in that house. Maybe I'm just used to how it smells. What about you, Maria? You didn't grow up there. Do you notice any unusual smells? Maria considered this carefully. Now that you mention it, there is something. I always attributed it to the age of the house. It was built in the 1960s. There's a musty smell and sometimes something that reminds me of, I don't know, like old batteries. Dr. Chen made more notes. Emma, besides the food, how do you feel when you're in your grandmother's house? Tired, Emma said immediately. And sometimes my head hurts, but not right away. It takes a while. How long? Emma looked at her mother for help. Maybe after we eat lunch? When we're watching TV? So, about an hour or two after arriving? Dr. Chen clarified. Emma nodded. Doctor. Chen turned to the parents. Do either of you experience headaches or fatigue during your visits? I mentioned to Dr. Peterson that I've been getting headaches, Carlos admitted, but I thought it was just stress. Work has been demanding lately. Carlos, I want you to think carefully. Do these headaches happen on other days, or primarily on Sundays after visiting your mother? Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. You know, now that you're asking specifically, I think they are mostly on Sundays and Sunday evenings. What about Diego, your younger son? Maria straightened in her chair. He's been more cranky on Sunday evenings, and he's been taking longer naps after we get home. I thought he was just tired from playing. Dr. Chen set down her pen and leaned forward. I'd like to examine Emma again, but I'm also going to recommend some additional tests. What you're describing sounds like it could be environmental exposure to something toxic. The word toxic hung in the air like a physical presence. Toxic? Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. You mean like poison? Not necessarily poison in the traditional sense, Dr. Chen explained carefully. But there are many substances that can cause the symptoms Emma is experiencing. Nausea, metallic taste, headaches, fatigue. Some people, especially children, are more sensitive to these exposures than others. Carlos leaned forward. What kind of substances? Could be anything from lead paint to carbon monoxide, mold, pesticides, or even issues with the water supply. Old houses can harbor all sorts of environmental hazards that accumulate over time. Dr. Chen conducted a thorough examination of Emma, paying particular attention to her neurological responses and any signs of heavy metal exposure. She also requested detailed blood work that would test for various toxins. "I'm also going to give you a symptom diary," she told the parents. "I want you to track not just Emma's symptoms, but everyone's. Note the time you arrive at the house, how long you stay, and any symptoms anyone experiences. Headaches, nausea, fatigue, anything unusual. Should we stop visiting my mother's house?" Carlos asked. Dr. Chen considered this carefully. "For now, I think it would be wise to limit your exposure until we get the test results back. If there is something environmental causing these symptoms, continued exposure could be harmful." The conversation with Rosa did not go well. "You're telling me my house is poisonous?" Rosa's voice was sharp with hurt and anger when Carlos called to explain their temporary absence from Sunday dinners. "Mom, the doctor just wants to run some tests. It's probably nothing, but Emma's symptoms are getting worse. That child has you all wrapped around her little finger. There's nothing wrong with my house. I've lived here for 30 years without any problems." "What about your headaches, Mom?" Carlos asked quietly. There was silence on the other end of the line. "What headaches?" Rosa finally asked. "You've mentioned having headaches for years, and you've been more tired lately. Even Aunt Carmen mentioned she was worried about how exhausted you seem." Another long pause. "Everyone gets headaches, Carlos. I'm 73 years old." But Carlos had planted a seed of doubt, and he could hear it in his mother's voice. The blood test results came back 3 days later. Emma's levels were within normal ranges for most toxins, but Dr. Chen noticed something concerning. "Her iron levels are slightly elevated," Dr. Chen explained during their follow-up appointment. "Not dangerously high, but higher than I'd expect for a child her age and diet." "What does that mean?" Maria asked. "It could indicate exposure to certain metals. I'd like to run a more comprehensive heavy metals panel." While they waited for those results, Maria diligently filled out the symptom diary Dr. Chen had provided. She was shocked to realize the patterns that emerged when she tracked everyone's health systematically. Carlos's Sunday headaches were consistent and severe. Diego had been unusually fussy and tired every Sunday evening for months. Even Maria herself had been experiencing mild nausea during their visits, though she'd attributed it to anxiety about Emma's behavior. "Look at this," she showed Carlos the diary after 2 weeks. "We're all getting sick there." Carlos stared at the documented symptoms with growing alarm. "How did we not notice this before?" "Because it was gradual, and we all explained it away. Your headaches were work stress. Diego's tiredness was from playing. My nausea was worry about Emma. And Emma was the canary in the coal mine," Carlos said quietly. The more comprehensive blood tests revealed the first concrete clue. Emma's lead levels, while not in the critically dangerous range, were elevated beyond what was normal for a child with no known exposure sources. Lead exposure would explain all of Emma's symptoms, Dr. Chen explained during their next appointment. The metallic taste, the nausea, the headaches, the fatigue. Children are much more sensitive to lead than adults, which is why Emma's symptoms appeared first and are the most severe. "But where would she be getting exposed to lead?" Maria asked. Older homes, especially those built before 1978, often contain lead-based paint. If the paint is chipping or if there's renovation work, it can create lead dust. Lead can also be found in old plumbing, particularly solder joints. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. "My mother's house was built in 1967. Has there been any renovation work done recently?" Carlos thought carefully. "Actually, yes. Mom had the kitchen repainted last spring. She hired some handyman to do it. I don't think he was licensed." Dr. Chen made notes. That could be the source. If he didn't properly prepare the surfaces or contain the lead dust, it could have contaminated the entire house, especially the kitchen and dining areas. "But why now?" Maria asked. "Emma has been eating there her whole life." Lead dust can be stirred up by renovation work and settle into cracks and crevices. It can then be released gradually over time, especially when disturbed by cooking heat, air circulation, or even just daily activities. Emma might have reached a threshold where her body could no longer tolerate the exposure. The pieces were falling into place, but Dr. Chen knew they needed more concrete evidence. I'm going to recommend that you have your mother's house tested for lead contamination, she told Carlos. There are certified professionals who can do dust wipe tests and air sampling. And in the meantime, no one should spend extended time in that house until we know for sure, especially not Emma or Diego. That evening, Carlos made one of the most difficult phone calls of his life. Mom, we need to talk about getting your house tested for lead. Rosa's response was immediate and defensive. Lead? That's ridiculous. People lived with lead paint for decades without problems. Mom, Emma's blood tests show lead exposure. The doctor says it's likely coming from your house. I don't believe it. These doctors, they're always trying to scare people with their tests and chemicals. Mom, please, if there is lead in your house, it's affecting your health too. You've been having more headaches lately, haven't you? And you're tired all the time. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, less certain. The painter, he said he didn't need to do all that preparation work the city requires, said it was just government red tape making things more expensive. Carlos closed his eyes. Mom, we need to get your house tested, and you need to get your blood tested too. I'm scared, Carlos. It was the first time his mother had admitted vulnerability in years. I know, Mom, but we'll figure this out together. As Carlos hung up the phone, he realized that Dr. Chen's investigation had uncovered more than just the source of Emma's illness. It had revealed how a family's trust in tradition and reluctance to question the familiar had nearly cost them their health. But the real revelation was still to come. The environmental testing company arrived at Rosa's house on a cold January morning, their white van loaded with sophisticated equipment that looked more suited for a crime scene than a cozy family home. Carlos stood in the driveway beside his mother, both of them watching as technicians in protective suits prepared to enter the house that had been home to 3 generations of Martinez family memories. This feels like overkill, Rosa muttered, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Mom, Dr. Chen says these tests will give us definitive answers, Carlos replied, though he had to admit the scene felt surreal. The lead testing technician, a woman named Jennifer Walsh with 20 years of experience, spent 3 hours systematically sampling dust from windowsills, door frames, and cooking surfaces. She paid particular attention to the kitchen, where the recent paint job had been done. I'll have preliminary results in 48 hours, she told Carlos as she packed up her equipment. But I can tell you that the dust wipe samples from your kitchen windowsill and the area around your stove showed visible residue that's consistent with lead contamination. Rosa's face went pale. Visible residue? Yes, ma'am. When lead paint is disturbed during renovation, it creates a fine dust that can settle throughout the house. It's particularly concentrated in areas where heat and air circulation cause it to accumulate. After the testing team left, Carlos found his mother sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the room she'd cooked in for 30 years. I keep thinking about all the meals I've prepared here, she said quietly. All the times Emma sat right where you're sitting now, eating my food. Mum, you couldn't have known. That painter, he seemed so sure he knew what he was doing. He was recommended by Mrs. Rodriguez next door. She said he did good work for cheap. Carlos reached across the table and took his mother's hand. We'll deal with whatever they find. The important thing is that we're addressing it now. But even as he spoke those reassuring words, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Chen suspected there was more to Emma's condition than just lead exposure. The pediatrician had been unusually thorough in her questioning, asking about things that seemed unrelated to lead poisoning. The preliminary test results confirmed their worst fears. The kitchen and dining room showed lead levels that were more than 10 times higher than the EPA's safety standards. The living room and bedrooms were also contaminated, though at lower levels. The good news is that this is remediable, Jennifer Walsh explained during her follow-up call. But it's going to require professional lead abatement. The house will need to be evacuated during the process. Rosa's blood test results came back the same day. Her lead levels were elevated, though not as high as Emma's. Dr. Chen explained that adults generally tolerate lead exposure better than children, but Rosa's chronic headaches and fatigue were likely symptoms of long-term, low-level exposure. I want to see the whole family again, Dr. Chen told Maria during their phone conversation. Including Rosa and Diego. There are some additional tests I'd like to run. When they gathered in Dr. Chen's office the following week, Emma looked healthier than she had in months. 3 weeks without exposure to Rosa's house had allowed her body to begin recovering. Her appetite had returned, and the dark circles under her eyes were fading. "Emma, you're looking much better," Dr. Chen observed. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Emma said with a smile. "I can eat all my food again without feeling sick." Dr. Chen turned to Diego, who had been unusually quiet during the appointment. "Diego, how are you feeling, buddy?" The 4-year-old looked up from the toy he'd been playing with. "My tummy doesn't hurt anymore on Sundays." Dr. Chen exchanged a meaningful look with the parents. Even Diego, at his young age, had been able to articulate that his symptoms were connected to their Sunday visits. "Rosa, how have you been feeling since you've been staying at Carlos and Maria's house?" Rosa had been living with her son's family since the lead contamination was discovered. "Better, actually. I haven't had a headache in over a week, and I'm sleeping better." "That's what I expected to hear," Dr. Chen said. "Lead exposure can cause all of those symptoms, but I want to discuss something else with all of you." She pulled out Emma's medical chart and several printed pages of test results. "While we've identified lead as a significant factor in Emma's illness, there are some aspects of her symptoms that don't fully align with typical lead poisoning cases." Maria leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Emma's sensitivity to the metallic taste and smell was immediate and severe. Lead poisoning usually develops more gradually. Also, her iron levels were elevated, which isn't typical for lead exposure alone. Carlos frowned. "So there's something else?" "Possibly. I'd like to run some additional environmental tests at Rosa's house. Specifically, I want to test for other heavy metals and check the water supply." Dr. Chen had been researching Emma's case extensively, consulting with environmental health specialists, and reviewing similar cases in the medical literature. Something about the pattern of symptoms bothered her. "There's another concern," she continued. "I've been in contact with some colleagues who specialize in environmental health. They've seen cases where lead contamination occurs alongside other toxins, particularly in older homes, with multiple renovation projects over the years." She pulled out a map of San Antonio and pointed to Rosa's neighborhood. "This area has a history of environmental issues. There was a battery recycling plant that operated about 2 miles from Rosa's house from 1978 to 1995. It was shut down due to soil contamination." Rosa's eyes widened. "I remember that place. There were always trucks going back and forth. We used to complain about the dust. The EPA cleaned up the immediate area around the plant, but there were concerns about broader soil contamination in the surrounding neighborhoods. Some homes in this area have tested positive for multiple heavy metals: lead, cadmium, and arsenic." "Arsenic?" Maria's voice was barely audible. "It's rare, but chronic low-level arsenic exposure can cause symptoms very similar to what Emma experienced: metallic taste, nausea, headaches, and neurological sensitivity. And it would explain why her reaction to food was so immediate and severe." Dr. Chen scheduled additional environmental testing for Rosa's property, including soil samples from the backyard garden where Rosa had grown vegetables for decades. "There's one more thing," Dr. Chen said as the family prepared to leave. "I want to test the whole family for a broader panel of heavy metals. If there's been multi-generational exposure to contaminated soil or water, it could affect everyone differently." That evening, Carlos called his sister Carmen, who lived in Phoenix but had grown up in the same house. "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about your answer." "What's wrong? You sound serious." "Do you remember having any health problems when we were kids? Headaches, stomach problems, anything like that?" Carmen was quiet for a moment. "Why are you asking?" Carlos explained about Emma's illness and the environmental contamination they'd discovered. "Oh my God, Carlos, you know I always wondered. I used to get terrible headaches as a teenager, and I had stomach problems for years. Mom always said I was just a nervous kid. Do you still have those problems?" "No, actually. They got better after I moved away for college. I always thought it was because I was less stressed." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. "Carmen, I think you need to get tested too. But I haven't lived there in over 20 years. The doctor says some heavy metals can stay in your system for a long time, and if there's been contamination in the soil for decades." Carmen agreed to get tested, and Carlos began reaching out to other family members who had spent significant time at Rosa's house over the years. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. His cousin Miguel, who had lived with Rosa for 2 years during high school, had suffered from chronic fatigue and digestive issues during that time. His aunt Elena, who had helped care for Rosa after her hip surgery 5 years earlier, had developed mysterious neurological symptoms that doctors had never been able to explain. Dr. Chen reviewed all of this information with growing concern. "This suggests a long-term multi-source contamination problem," she told Carlos and Maria during their next appointment. "We're not just dealing with recent lead paint disturbance. There may be deeper environmental issues affecting that property." The comprehensive soil testing results came back 2 weeks later, and they confirmed Dr. Chen's suspicions. The backyard soil contained elevated levels of lead, arsenic, and cadmium. The contamination was concentrated in areas where Rosa had maintained her vegetable garden for 3 decades. "The vegetables," Rosa whispered when Carlos told her the results. "I've been feeding my family contaminated vegetables for 30 years. Mom, you didn't know. No one knew." But Rosa was inconsolable. "Emma used to help me pick tomatoes from that garden. She would eat them right off the vine." Dr. Chen called an emergency family meeting to discuss the full scope of the contamination. "The soil contamination explains why Emma's symptoms were so severe and immediate," she explained. "If she had been consuming vegetables grown in contaminated soil, her body would have been dealing with multiple toxins simultaneously. The recent lead paint disturbance was just the final stressor that pushed her system beyond its ability to cope." Maria felt sick to her stomach. "How long has she been exposed?" "Based on what you've told me about her eating habits at Rosa's house, probably her entire life. But children's bodies are remarkably resilient. The good news is that with proper treatment and no further exposure, most of the damage can be reversed." Dr. Chen outlined a comprehensive treatment plan that included chelation therapy to help Emma's body eliminate the heavy metals, nutritional supplements to address deficiencies, and ongoing monitoring of her neurological development. "What about the rest of us?" Carlos asked. "Everyone will need treatment. Some of you may require more intensive intervention than others, depending on your exposure levels and how long you've been affected." As they left Dr. Chen's office that day, Carlos realized that what had started as concern about his 8-year-old daughter's eating habits had uncovered a multi-generational environmental health crisis that had been slowly poisoning his family for decades. But Dr. Chen still had one more crucial question to ask, a question that would reveal the most shocking truth of all. 3 weeks after the comprehensive soil testing results came back, Dr. Chen requested a family meeting that would include not just Emma's immediate family, but also Rosa and any other relatives who had spent significant time at the contaminated property. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February, and Dr. Chen's tone when she called suggested this would be more than a routine follow-up. Carlos arrived at the medical office with Maria, Emma, Diego, and Rosa. His sister Carmen had flown in from Phoenix the night before, and his cousin Miguel drove down from Austin. Even Aunt Eleanor, despite her ongoing neurological issues, insisted on being present. Dr. Chen's office had been rearranged to accommodate the larger group, with additional chairs arranged in a semicircle. On her desk were several thick folders and what appeared to be official documents from various environmental agencies. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Chen began, her expression serious but compassionate. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time for your family, and what I'm about to share will help explain the full scope of what you've been dealing with." She opened the first folder and pulled out a series of charts showing the test results for each family member. "Let me start with the good news. Emma's latest blood work shows significant improvement. Her lead levels have dropped by nearly 40% since she stopped being exposed to the contaminated environment. Diego's levels are also improving, though not as dramatically." Emma, who had been quietly coloring in a book Dr. Chen provided, looked up with a smile. She had gained back most of the weight she'd lost and was eating normally again. "Rosa, your levels are also decreasing, but more slowly, which is expected given the duration of your exposure." Dr. Chen turned to Carmen and Miguel. "Your test results were particularly interesting. Carmen, even though you moved away over 20 years ago, you still show trace levels of heavy metals that are consistent with childhood exposure. Miguel, your levels are higher, which correlates with the 2 years you lived at Rosa's house during high school." Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I always wondered why I felt so sick during that time. Everyone said it was just teenage stress." "What about Aunt Elena?" Carlos asked, looking at his elderly aunt who had been unusually quiet. Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Elena's case is particularly concerning. Her neurological symptoms, the tremors, memory issues, and coordination problems are consistent with long-term heavy metal exposure. But there's something else. She pulled out another set of documents. I've been working with the EPA and the Texas Department of Health to research the history of environmental contamination in your neighborhood. What we've discovered goes beyond what any of us initially suspected. Dr. Chen spread out a detailed map of Rosa's neighborhood, with various properties marked in different colors. The battery recycling plant that operated from 1978 to 1995 wasn't just contaminating the soil with heavy metals. EPA records show that the plant was illegally dumping waste materials for years before it was shut down. But here's what's most disturbing. Some of that waste was being sold as fill dirt to construction companies and landscaping businesses. Rosa leaned forward, her face pale. Fill dirt? Yes, contaminated soil was being distributed throughout the area for use in residential projects, driveways, landscaping, even as base material for home foundations. Carlos felt his stomach drop. Are you saying our house was built on contaminated fill? Not built on it necessarily, but your property records show that in 1982, your mother had significant landscaping work done, including the installation of raised garden beds and a new driveway. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. I remember that. We hired a company that said they could give us a good deal on quality fill dirt for the garden beds. They said it was rich soil that would be perfect for growing vegetables. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For over 30 years, Rosa had been growing vegetables in soil that was intentionally contaminated with industrial waste from a battery recycling plant. This explains why the contamination is so concentrated in your backyard garden area, Dr. Chen continued, and why the levels of multiple heavy metals are so high. You weren't just dealing with naturally occurring contamination or simple lead paint exposure. Your family has been consuming vegetables grown in industrial waste. Carmen started crying quietly. We ate those vegetables every Sunday for years. Emma helped pick them. We thought we were eating healthy, homegrown food. Dr. Chen nodded sympathetically. The tragedy is that you were trying to do something good for your family. There was no way you could have known. But wait, Maria said, her voice shaky. If the contamination has been there since 1982, why did Emma's symptoms only start appearing last year? This was the question Dr. Chen had been waiting for. She pulled out one final folder, this one marked with official EPA seals. That brings me to why I called this meeting, she said, her tone becoming even more serious. Emma's symptoms started appearing in September of last year, correct? Yes, Maria confirmed. Late September. And Rosa, when exactly did you have your kitchen painted? It was in the spring. April, I think. Dr. Chen nodded. The lead paint disturbance in April created additional contamination inside the house, but there was another event that occurred around the same time that I believe was the real trigger for Emma's acute symptoms. She opened the EPA folder and pulled out a series of photographs and official reports. In March of last year, the city began construction on a new water treatment facility about half a mile from your neighborhood. The construction required extensive excavation and soil disruption. What they discovered during that excavation was additional contaminated soil from the old battery plant, soil that had been buried and forgotten for decades. Carlos leaned forward. What does that have to do with Mum's house? The construction stirred up contaminated dust and particles that had been dormant for years. Air quality monitoring during that period showed elevated levels of heavy metals in the atmosphere throughout your neighborhood. But here's the critical detail. The contamination was concentrated in areas downwind from the construction site. Dr. Chen pointed to Rosa's house on the map. Your mother's property is directly downwind from the construction site. For months, contaminated dust was settling on her house, her yard, and most importantly, on her vegetable garden. Rosa was staring at the map in horror. You mean the vegetables I was growing last summer were not only growing in contaminated soil, but were also being covered with contaminated dust from the construction site. The levels of toxins in your garden last summer were likely the highest they'd ever been. The room was completely silent as everyone processed this information. Emma's body had been dealing with low-level exposure her entire life, Dr. Chen continued. But last summer, the contamination reached a critical threshold. Her sensitive 8-year-old system finally said enough and began rejecting food from that environment entirely. Maria was crying now. She was trying to protect herself. Exactly. Children often have better instinctive reactions to environmental dangers than adults. Emma's body was telling her that something in that house was making her sick, even when the adults around her couldn't detect it. Dr. Chen closed the folders and looked around the room at the faces of 3 generations of the Martinez family, all of whom had been unknowingly poisoned by the very place they considered home. Now I need to ask you all a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. The room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Chen looked directly at Rosa, then at each family member in turn. Rosa, in all the years you've lived in that house, in all the time you've been growing vegetables in that garden and cooking meals in that kitchen, has anyone, a city inspector, a health department official, an environmental agency, ever come to your neighborhood to test for contamination from the battery plant? Rosa blinked, clearly confused by the question. Test for contamination? No, never. No one ever told us there might be contamination. Dr. Chen's expression hardened. That's what I was afraid of. She opened her laptop and pulled up a series of official documents. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to show you will explain why your family has suffered for decades without anyone ever investigating the source of your health problems. The silence in the room was absolute as Dr. Chen prepared to reveal the most shocking truth of all, the reason why a family had been slowly poisoned for 30 years, while the authorities who should have protected them remained silent. The EPA has known about the widespread soil contamination in your neighborhood since 1997. They've known about the illegal dumping, the contaminated fill dirt, and the health risks to residents. But here's the question that's going to change everything. If they've known for over 20 years, why were you never told? Every person in the room stared at Dr. Chen in stunned silence as the full weight of her question settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The answer would reveal a cover-up that went far beyond environmental contamination, a deliberate decision by multiple agencies to hide the truth from families like the Martinezes, condemning them to decades of illness while protecting the interests of those responsible for the contamination. The silence in Dr. Chen's office stretched for what felt like an eternity after her devastating question. Rosa was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. They knew. For 20 years they knew we were being poisoned. Dr. Chen nodded grimly and turned her laptop screen toward the family. What I'm about to show you is the result of 3 weeks of investigation that I conducted with the help of environmental lawyers and investigative journalists who specialize in environmental justice cases. The screen displayed an EPA internal memo dated March 15, 1997, with the subject line, Residential Contamination Assessment, Former Apex Battery Recycling Facility. This memo was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, Dr. Chen explained. It clearly states that soil sampling in your neighborhood showed contamination levels that pose significant health risks to residents, particularly children and pregnant women. Carlos leaned forward to read the document. It says they recommended immediate notification of residents and offers of temporary relocation. Keep reading, Dr. Chen said. Maria read aloud from the next paragraph. However, due to budget constraints and potential legal liability, the decision has been made to classify this information as pending further study and delay public notification until alternative remediation strategies can be explored. The room erupted in shocked voices as the family members began to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. They decided not to tell us to save money. Carmen's voice was shaking with rage. Dr. Chen pulled up more documents. It gets worse. In 2003, another study was conducted that confirmed the original findings and identified your specific street as having some of the highest contamination levels in the area. Again, the recommendation was immediate notification and remediation. And again, they did nothing, Miguel said, his fists clenched. Correct, but here's the most damning evidence. Dr. Chen displayed a series of emails between EPA officials and local health department administrators from 2010. They were specifically discussing the health risks to children in contaminated areas, and one official wrote, "We need to balance public health concerns against the economic impact on property values and potential lawsuits." Rosa had gone completely pale. They let us poison our children to protect property values. The correspondence suggests that multiple agencies were aware that public notification would trigger massive lawsuits property devaluation, and demands for expensive cleanup. So they chose to classify the information and wait, hoping the problem would resolve itself over time. Dr. Chen pulled up one final document that made everyone in the room gasp. It was a health department study from 2018 that tracked illness patterns in neighborhoods surrounding the former battery plant. This study shows that your neighborhood has had unusually high rates of neurological disorders, developmental delays in children, and chronic fatigue syndromes for the past 2 decades. The study concludes that these patterns are consistent with heavy metal exposure, but recommends only continued monitoring. "They've been watching us get sick," Elena said, her voice filled with disbelief. "For years they've been studying us like lab rats." Dr. Chen closed her laptop and faced the family. Emma's case is what's called a sentinel event in environmental health, a clear, undeniable case that exposes a much larger problem. Her symptoms were so acute and specific that they couldn't be ignored or explained away. "What happens now?" Carlos asked. "Now you have choices to make. But first, let me tell you what I've already set in motion." Dr. Chen explained that she had been working with environmental lawyers who specialized in government cover-up cases. Emma's medical records, combined with the family's extensive contamination evidence, provided the foundation for a federal lawsuit against multiple agencies. "More importantly," she continued, "I've been in contact with families throughout your neighborhood who have experienced similar health problems. There are at least 30 families who have children with developmental issues, adults with chronic illnesses, and elderly residents with neurological problems that can all be traced to this contamination." 30 families, Rosa repeated in shock. "At minimum. Some families moved away over the years because of health problems they couldn't explain. Others simply accepted their illnesses as bad luck or genetics. But when you map the health problems against the contamination data, the pattern is undeniable." Dr. Chen had organized what she called a community health justice initiative. With the help of environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, and public health advocates, she was building a case that would force government agencies to acknowledge their decades-long cover-up and provide comprehensive health care and remediation for all affected families. "The lawsuit will likely take years," she warned, "but the immediate impact has already begun. Local news stations are preparing investigative reports, and federal legislators are calling for hearings on environmental justice failures." 3 days after the family meeting, the story broke on the evening news. The headline read, "30-Year Cover-Up: How Government Agencies Hid Toxic Contamination from San Antonio Families." The investigative report featured Emma's story as the catalyst that exposed the cover-up, but it quickly expanded to show the broader pattern of government negligence and corporate responsibility. The former Apex Battery Recycling Company, it turned out, had been sold multiple times over the years, with each new owner avoiding cleanup responsibilities through legal loopholes. Rosa's house became the center of media attention, with reporters and camera crews documenting the contaminated garden where she had grown vegetables for 3 decades. The visual impact was powerful. An elderly woman who had tried to feed her family healthy, homegrown food, unknowingly poisoning them with industrial waste. "I trusted the soil," Rosa told one reporter, standing in her backyard with tears in her eyes. "I trusted that if something was dangerous, someone would tell us. I never imagined that people in government offices knew we were in danger and decided not to warn us." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Environmental groups, civil rights organizations, and public health advocates rallied around the Martinez family and their neighbors. A GoFundMe campaign to help families with medical expenses and temporary housing raised over $200,000 in the first week. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Other communities across the country who had experienced similar cover-ups began coming forward with their own stories. Emma's case had inadvertently triggered a national conversation about environmental justice and government accountability. Dr. Chen found herself at the center of this movement, testifying before congressional committees and consulting with other physicians who had discovered similar patterns of contamination and cover-up in their own communities. Emma Martinez's story represents thousands of children across America who have been failed by the systems designed to protect them, she told a Senate subcommittee on environmental health. Her 8-year-old body did what our government agencies refused to do. It recognized the danger and refused to accept it. 6 months after Emma first refused to eat at her grandmother's house, the EPA announced a comprehensive cleanup plan for the entire neighborhood. All affected families were provided with temporary housing during the remediation process, and a specialized medical program was established to provide ongoing health monitoring and treatment. Rosa's house required complete soil replacement, professional lead abatement, and extensive renovation to eliminate all sources of contamination. The process took 4 months, but when it was finished, the house was safer than it had ever been. The first meal Emma ate in the renovated house was, appropriately, tamales made by Rosa, using ingredients from a certified organic garden installed by the EPA as part of the remediation. Emma took her first bite tentatively, as everyone held their breath. "They taste like Grandma's tamales should taste," she announced with a smile that brought tears to everyone's eyes. But the real resolution came in the form of systemic changes that would prevent other families from experiencing what the Martinezes had endured. The congressional hearings led to new legislation requiring immediate public notification of environmental health risks, regardless of economic considerations. The Emma Martinez Environmental Justice Act was signed into law 18 months after Emma first refused to eat at her grandmother's house. Dr. Chen continued to work with the family throughout Emma's recovery and beyond. Emma's lead levels returned to normal within a year, and her neurological development remained on track. Diego showed no lasting effects from his exposure, and even Rosa's chronic health problems improved significantly once the contamination source was eliminated. Emma's instincts saved not just her own life, but potentially the lives of hundreds of other children, Dr. Chen wrote in a medical journal article about the case. This case demonstrates the critical importance of listening to children when they try to tell us something is wrong, even when adults can't immediately understand what they're sensing. The Martinez family's ordeal also highlighted the devastating impact of environmental racism and economic discrimination. Their predominantly Hispanic working-class neighborhood had been deliberately excluded from environmental protections that were provided to wealthier, whiter communities with similar contamination issues. Emma didn't choose to be the canary in the coal mine, Carlos reflected during a television interview 2 years later, but she saved our family and showed the world that children's voices matter, even when they're telling us things we don't want to hear. Rosa, now in her 70s and healthier than she'd been in decades, became an unlikely activist for environmental justice. She testified at hearings, spoke at community meetings, and worked with other elderly residents who had unknowingly been exposed to environmental hazards. "I spent 30 years thinking I was taking good care of my family," she said during one speaking engagement. "I was growing fresh vegetables, cooking healthy meals, keeping a clean house. But no one told me that the soil itself was poison. No one told me that the people who were supposed to protect us had decided we weren't worth protecting." Emma, now 10 years old and thriving, occasionally accompanied her grandmother to these speaking events. She had become something of a symbol for children's environmental health rights, though her family was careful to protect her privacy and normal childhood experiences. "I just didn't want to eat the food that made me feel bad," Emma explained to a group of medical students during one of Dr. Chen's lectures. "I wish grown-ups would listen when kids say something is wrong." The case also led to the discovery of dozens of other illegal dumping sites throughout Texas and across the country. The Apex Battery Recycling Company investigation revealed a network of companies that had been disposing of toxic waste in residential areas for decades, always targeting low-income communities with limited political power. 5 years after Emma first refused to eat at Rosa's house, the family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner in the fully remediated home. The walls were painted with safe, lead-free paint. The garden bloomed with vegetables grown in clean, certified soil. The air was free of contamination, and the water tested clean. Emma, now 13, helped her grandmother prepare the meal they had shared for generations, but now they could enjoy it without fear. The tamales tasted exactly as they always had in Emma's earliest memories, warm, loving, and safe. As they sat around the same dining room table where Emma had first refused to eat 5 years earlier, Carlos raised his glass of water that had been tested and certified safe. "To Emma," he said, "for trusting her instincts and saving our family. To all the families who weren't as lucky as we were," Rosa added, "and to making sure this never happens to anyone else." Emma smiled and took a big bite of her grandmother's tamale, savoring not just the familiar flavors, but the knowledge that the food was finally, truly safe. Her simple act of refusal had not only saved her own life, but had sparked a movement that would protect thousands of other children from similar danger. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with a child's quiet voice saying, "Something's wrong here." And sometimes when adults finally listen, that voice can change the world.